David Brewster here, new episode of Chordplay. This is Shake Your Foundations, a tribute to Malcolm Young of AC/DC. And if you search around on the channel, you'll find the original AC/DC Chordplay episode, also a 3-for-all episode for Angus Young, where we looked at some of his licks. But this episode's a tribute to Malcolm Young, so it's rhythm guitar, and it's going to be very basic. We're going to look at power chords and implied chords, partial chords, and this interplay between the brothers, Angus and Malcolm Young. Of course, Malcolm Young's passed away. I think Stevie Young, one of the other brothers in the Young family, has stepped in to replace Malcolm Young. But it's really interesting to notice this link or bond between brothers. The Young brothers, of course you can look at the Van Halen brothers, the Robinson brothers from the Black Crowes, or maybe the DeLeo brothers from Stone Temple Pilots. There's a lot of famous brothers, in rock and roll. The Knopfler brothers from Dire Straits is another example. But there's something about this brotherly connection, brothers or sisters, or it could be sister and brother, but that family bond or link, you can hear it in the music. So while I did the research to put this episode together, I actually dove into George Young, and I remember hearing about George Young as far as, influencing Angus and Malcolm, but I never really dove into it, and as far as the history and figuring out, who is George Young? George is actually the older brother of Angus and Malcolm. And both the brothers admit that George was a huge musical influence because he played with a band called the Easy Beats, and they kind of found, some hits or popularity back in the 60s. But that influenced both the brothers. And George also produced the early AC/DC albums. I think he produced or co-produced everything all the way up until Highway to Hell. But there's a book actually about the Young family. I haven't read this book yet, but I discovered that too, and I can't wait to find this book and dive into it. Really interesting stuff. And aside from his brother George, other influences for Malcolm Young include people like Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry. I read Peter Green, the early Fleetwood Mac stuff, and T-Rex. But here's an image with some of Malcolm Young's, influences. Keep in mind these are chord influences. Pete Townsend from The Who and the Kinks and groups like that. But here's Malcolm's kind of core influences. If you really watch Malcolm Young play, old concert footage or videos or whatever, you're going to notice certain things. His hand position. I think I mentioned this in the original AC/DC Chordplay episode. But his thumb is kind of an elusive secret weapon. He uses his thumb not really for fretting, it's more for muting and dampening. And you'll notice his thumb is kind of almost parallel with the neck like that. And you'll see his fingers kind of wrap around like this. But here's an image showing this kind of placement of Malcolm's thumb. So the music in this episode is going to come from 4 select AC/DC albums. And of course I stuck with the old stuff, the Bon Scott era. Which, no offense to the Brian Johnson, era that came after Back in Black. But I love that 70s AC/DC. It's raw and gritty and rowdy and everything. I don't know what it is. Of course, Bon Scott's a big part of that too. But there's just something about Malcolm Young's style, especially the way he played back in the 70s. And he didn't really change much as you move into the 80s and 90s. It's still Malcolm Young. But you can really pick out, what he played back in the day. I guess the way they recorded it and his guitar tone or whatever. You could really separate, Malcolm and Angus Young. The opening, that's Rock and Roll Singer from High Voltage. That's one of my favorite AC/DC songs. There's just something about it. And something like this. just stuck with the rhythm part that time. I think I played Angus's lead a little bit in the intro. But right there, you're just basically banging on this B power chord twice. And then this B, A, B, A. And then you're doing an E power chord right there. The first time it's the lower strings, and then the second time you hear the top strings. I think this is actually Angus and Malcolm together. But when you hear the album, it sounds like this. Because you kind of hear the chord the first time, and then you hear those upper strings the second time. Kind of ringing. I suspect that's actually Malcolm Young playing that. So that intro. Do it again. Then you want to start doing this. Just a B power chord, and then lift up that B note to the open A, which is the flat 7 of B. And you kind of have that bouncy, riff. Then you hear that riff again, do it twice. And then a D power chord to an E power chord. And then go right back to that B riff. I used the TC Electronic Ditto looper to loop that rhythm part, and then I started playing around with some of Angus's lead, like this. Whatever that is. I mean, it's a cool lead, too, in that intro part. But I love that interplay. Malcolm's banging out chords, and Angus is either playing some higher rhythm part, or a solo, or a fill, or some kind of finger pluck thing, or something else. And I love that contrast between their playing styles. So up next is a power chord primer. What we're going to do here is chip away at some of these ideas that Malcolm liked to use, and you're actually going to see, some of these unusual, chord and fingering arrangements, and dampening and muting strings, and leaving certain notes out of chords, and kind of just basically looking at his approach to chords. So the first thing we're going to do here, we're just going to walk down, a D power chord, A power chord to an E power chord. And just little 2-note or 2-string, chord shapes like this. Right there, it sounds like the beginning of an AC/DC song. Could be. You had like a steady drum beat, maybe a steady bass, 8th note bass riff or something. That sounds like AC/DC already. But just 2 strings, or 2 notes per chord. A D and an A and an E, and an E and a B. Now let's beef those chords up into 3-note versions. So there's a 3-note D5, a 3-note A5, and then a 3-note E5 right there. Do it again. Batch here, do a 4-note E5, or sorry, 4-note D5. So it's like a D5 over A right there. So it's a D power chord, but we're opening up that A string and including that too. And just a regular A5. And then here's that kind of elusive E5 we had in Rock and Roll Singer. Now you might see Malcolm do it that way. That's just a 1-fingered version. And I'm barring the 2nd fret there on the A and the D. I'm actually muting with the underside of my index finger. I'm muting that G string. And then I'm also kind of rolling my finger, or kind of curling my finger to where the B and the high E are going to be able to ring open, like that. So if I pick through it, that G string is muted, and then that B and high E are still ringing in there. You could do the same thing with 2 fingers right here. You could fret that B note and that E, and then allow your middle finger to kind of lay against that G string. You could do it that way too. Another way that you might see Malcolm do this, he actually picked this up from watching Pete Townsend. This is the Pete Townsend mute. But play an E major chord like that, like a cowboy E major, but you want to mute that G string. It looks like you're playing it, but you're actually muting it right there. We're not using that G sharp. So there's 3 different ways of playing that same chord. Like that. Just make sure you don't fret that G sharp, which I think I just did. Now, another thing he likes to do, he would use that same Pete Townsend mute on other chords, like maybe walking down from this D to this C sus2. He would use the underside of his middle finger to mute the D right there, and he'd play it like that. The same thing with that G power chord. When you move down to that G root note, the underside of your middle finger is actually muting that A string, so you can play that. So you're actually strumming 5 strings, but you only hear 4 of them. That one's muted. So there you could walk down D, A to E. Or the other way, this D, C sus2 to G5. And then right here, this is kind of a Malcolm Young chord scale. So it's not really a harmonized, major scale or minor scale, which is technically a chord scale or a scale built of chords. I'm just calling it a Malcolm Young chord scale. But we're going to start with this low E, and it reveals a lot of his favorite chords, but this low E5, something like that. One more time. Descend too. And right there, all I did is just walked up E5, and then this D over F sharp, which Malcolm definitely played that a lot. G5, A5, and then it's a G over B, C sus2 again, D5. And then the Townsend mute on that E. So even though that's not really a harmonized scale, it is implying basically E minor or E Aeolian right here. But we're doing it like this. So it's an implied Aeolian or natural minor sound, but that's kind of what's happening there. And we're kind of walking up like that. Are some of Malcolm Young's favorite chords for sure right there. For an example, using some of the chords we just looked at, check out Problem Child from Dirty Deeds and you'll hear this. So it really just starts with this D5 to A5 and then D5 to G, and you're just banging back and forth. Really basic. And then you hear it flip to this G to D5. And then this A to E5. Right there, it's building that intensity to go to the chorus. You can hear it, you can feel it, but that's a great example of using these really basic chords. But Malcolm's just rocking out right there. Another example of this tight interplay using very basic power chords. Check out the song If You Want Blood, You Got It from Highway to Hell, and you'll hear this. Really basic, but it's just riffing between this A to D, and you do actually hear more of the chord. You're actually hearing part of that G or D major and a little bit more of the G, like that. So he definitely sounds like he's hitting or accenting the upper part of those chords. And then you are hearing like some of the bass notes creep in there too. So when you get to that D and G move, really the top part's more important than the bottom. So don't really worry so much about the root. You want it in there, but it's that top part that seems more important, like that. Here's an AC/DC song with some elusive chords. This is Night Prowler from Highway to Hell. And it starts really basic with some, basic power chords. It's got a blues feel, but it's during the verse part where those elusive chords kind of sneak in. But Night Prowler is something like this. First part is really basic, just A to a D power chord, and that C sus2 to D, and that bluesy, kind of single note riff walking back into that A. Occasionally you hear it pick through on that C to D. You're going to go through that a few times. There's an opening solo. Then during the verse, that's where the elusive part is. You've got this A, and then a D over A right there. And then I'm hearing this, which is really cool. And you actually hear this, similar kind of chord move in other AC/DC songs. But right there you hear this lower kind of twist in the chord, which is so cool. But that A to a D over A. And then technically I'm going to think of this as a D sus4 over A, and then D over A. So that, D and G, that's your D sus4, but that A root note. And notice I'm kind of lining up my fingers like that. I guess you could bar that with one finger. But then the trick is you need to move that G note back to F sharp like that. So that's why I usually do it this way. I'm not really honestly sure how. Maybe Malcolm might have done this. Like that, just to make it easier. But you definitely hear that lower kind of chord in the mix. Prowler and really listen for that lower kind of growling chord, because I suspect that's what Malcolm was doing right there. Here's another elusive AC/DC song, Touch Too Much from Highway to Hell, and I've seen this played and transcribed in a lot of different ways, but to my ear it sounds something like this. Something like that. So it's definitely, like really interesting kind of picking on the low E. It's very distinct and unusual, kind of accented every once in a while. There's a lot of handling noise too. You hear this kind of clucky, plucky kind of sound. Something like that. Really aggressive and kind of unusual sounding. And I've seen players, move from just E, C, A. And eventually in the song, they do start using those chords. But I think during the intro, I think really Angus might be the one playing this, but I think he's just using the low E, just a single E. And then you hear it move to C, but it really just sounds like one note. And then an A, but a single A. It doesn't really sound like chords. But one thing I've done over the years just to fill it out, because I'm usually playing this by myself, is I grab that E note there on the A string like this. And that's part of the C major right there. And also A5 right there. And then you hear Angus with that higher. It's like A major and A sus4 way up there. actually if Malcolm played it that way. But that's just the way I kind of adapted, my part to that riff over the years, because it sounds better, or it sounds closer to the album if I play that by myself, like that. And it sounds closer than this. That just doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound like it. And that makes me suspect that maybe Angus is just playing a single note like that. Because the song definitely builds. So it's up to you. I don't really know exactly what's going on there. I'm not sure. Angus could probably tell us. But that's what I've done over the years. Just included that additional E note to just fatten it out a little bit. Another thing that Malcolm and Angus like to do with their chords is the way they would split off. And sometimes they would play the exact same riff and the same series of chords in the same place. And then sometimes they would deviate or split, and like maybe Malcolm's playing lower and Angus is playing higher somewhere. And they did this a lot. But think of that same, riff of chords, like that D, A to E we were playing with earlier. Let's call that Malcolm's part. And then Angus might answer that like this. Instead of playing the exact same chords, he would play, D, A to E, but in a different way. So instead of this, and let's say hypothetically, Angus might do this. Right? Same chords, there's D, and then technically A over C sharp to E. Matches those chords in a different way. And then when you put that together, it sounds really cool, like this. I'm looping that too. I don't know if you can hear it. Lots of examples of that in AC/DC's music. The last example is from Rock and Roll Damnation from the Power Edge album, and this is a great example of that interplay or split between Malcolm and Angus's guitar parts. So really Malcolm in the intro is just doing this. A power chord to a D over A power chord, like a D5 over A. So I'm going to loop that with a TC Electronic Diddle Looper, and then you hear Angus do this. Behind or on top of those chords. So that's basically a little part of A7, and then a D over A right there. But then together you hear this. Very basic. Like I said, it's just, a ringing A5 and a ringing D5 to that little piece of A7 and D over A. But that totally sounds like AC/DC, big time. I mean, if you didn't know the song, you could hear it and think that's totally an AC/DC song. But, and then after that it starts doing... kind of a standard, rock and roll riff, A5 and that D over A right there. But notice that interplay like in the beginning part, very basic, ringing chords and very easy. But you can hear Angus and Malcolm do that in Back in Black and You Shook Me All Night Long and a whole bunch of their classic songs. That's going to wrap this episode of Chordplay with Shake Your Foundations, and I didn't want to confuse anybody. I did include Shake Your Foundations in the original AC/DC Chordplay episode. So I didn't include that riff in this episode because we've already looked at it. But I just used that that name or that title because that's kind of what we're doing. We're shaking up your foundations as far as these basic chords, maybe reworking the way you use power chords or arrange power chords. And even if you don't play in a two-guitar band, or maybe you're not even in a band, maybe you're just recording, some music and ideas at home. keep these ideas in the back of your mind, as far as splitting guitar parts, maybe arranging a chord sequence or progression, and split it off. Like maybe, have one guitar play lower, another guitar play higher, maybe accent things, a little bit differently between the guitars or something like that. And you can definitely hear AC/DC pioneering these sounds, way back since the early 70s, which is so cool. So anyway, leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to my lessons, and I'll be back before you know with more content and material. Thank you.